In this lesson, we're going to talk about typography and how to use text in your document. I will share with you some do's and don'ts and general best practices about how to use text in your design. If you're anything like me, you're easily distracted by pretty stuff. So while scrolling through some templates, looking for something to use for your next content piece, you will come across something that really catches your eye and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to use this. I love this font. I love those colors. And you create something and it's beautiful, but it's not your brand. So the very first rule I want to instill into you is always use your brand fonts. And along with that, always use your brand colors as well. I always tell my clients that you want the people that you're trying to attract, so new students, current students, alumni, whoever watches your social media feed, you want them to recognize your brand without seeing your name or your logo. And you do that by being very consistent in the way you create content, by always using the same colors and always using the same fonts. So Canva has a lot of pretty stuff. And if you click on text, there are some fun ideas, some cool ideas, some pretty ideas that you want to use because it just looks cool. But if it's not on brand, don't use it unless it's a special event or something where you just create a look just for this event. It still has to match your brand, but for everyday content that you're creating, stick with your brand fonts. Canva makes it really easy by giving you the styles tab here where you can use your brand kit, and when you select fonts, you also have your brand fonts right here. Use them and stick with them. Number 2, never use more than 3 fonts per design. If you're sticking with your brand fonts, you won't have that problem. So just to start there. But if you're worried that you won't get enough variety in your design, or you want to make certain words stand out and you don't know how to do that, there are lots of different ways of doing that without changing the font. These include using these things up here. So different color can make a font stand out. You can bold it to make it stand out. You can italicize it to make it stand out. Or you can do all 3 things. You can also underline it. So there's different ways you can really make this happen without having to change the font. Another way of doing it is using sizing. You can just make it bigger and smaller, right? Same thing, same font, same color, same everything except for the size. And you can create a hierarchy and make it look differently just by doing that. Another way of doing it is, as you can see here, using all caps. That can make a difference. Looks very different from that. Same font. And one more thing that I like to do, especially when using all caps, is increasing the kerning, and that is the spacing between the letters. So as you can see here on the letter spacing, I have it set to 100. If we look at what this looks like in 0, it looks kind of cramped. So when I use all caps, I like to increase the letter spacing. I usually do 100, but depending on what I'm doing, sometimes I use 200 or 300 even. But you can just try out different things. There's lots of different ways you can create something different without using a different font. By keeping the same font, you make sure that everything looks like it belongs together. It's a cohesive look throughout all your design. I just told you that I like using all caps. Here's one thing though. Don't use all caps on a lot of text at once. If I would turn these bullet points into all caps, they all of a sudden got a lot harder to read. So there are some things about all caps that are really useful. Like it looks nice in headlines if you don't have more than 2 or 3 words. but don't use it in copy text or just really long text, because it doesn't really help the readability of your text. And it looks like you're yelling, and nobody wants to get yelled at. So use all caps wisely. And along with that, never use all caps with handwritten and cursive fonts, because they're not meant to be used like that. Let me just show you what that looks like. They're impossible to read. Here's one when they're in all caps. And this is not even that bad. I mean, it's not, I don't recommend it at all, but it's even readable. But some of them are downright not readable once you turn them into all caps. Let's see what this one looks like. This is just not meant to be used like this. It doesn't look right either. It doesn't make sense. Nobody hands write even like that. When somebody writes all caps, they would print the letters. They would not use cursive letters to use, to write all caps. So it is meant to be used like this. Another thing you don't do with cursive or handwritten fonts is you don't apply kerning. So what I just told you about the letter spacing in all caps, you do not do that with handwritten or cursive font, because it just blows the whole font apart. The designers spend hours and hours to make sure that the letters all connect properly in a cursive font. So it actually looks like it was written in one go, right? If you apply letter spacing, you blow all of that apart. So don't do that. Don't use all caps with handwritten and cursive fonts. Don't use the spacing, the letter spacing with it. Next thing I want you to think about is the alignment of your text. So let's change this back to our brand fonts here so we can read better. If I have lots of text, even bullet points like this, we don't want to center it, because this makes it really hard for our brain to figure out where the next line starts. It's not too bad here because they're short, but if I have longer paragraphs and I center everything, it's really, really hard to read, because our brain gets to the end of the sentence or to the end of the line and then has to jump forward, because we read from left to right in this culture. It has to jump all the way here and then find where the beginning is. And if that changes all the time, it just takes us a lot longer to do that. And we don't want to make it more complicated for people. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to read and understand our text. So obviously with bullet points, it's a really bad idea, especially in Canva, because it still aligns the bullet points in the front. But some typesetting apps, they would move the bullet points in front of the lines, but it's still not better. If you have bullet points, left align them. Right aligning doesn't work in this case either. This is the best way. It makes your eyes like exhale, like, it's so much easier. I know where to go, right? So that's a really important thing. If you have long text and if you have bullet points, do not change it to center alignment or right alignment. I already talked a little bit about letter spacing, especially with all caps and never with handwritten fonts. Line spacing is something that can be really useful as well, because it can really increase readability of long text. So if I have a lot of text, and this is not quite a lot of text yet, but if I click over here and reduce the line spacing, so this is the default. 1.4 is the default, and it's pretty good. If I have long text, this is pretty good. Now with my bullet points, it looks a little bit cramped to me. So I like to increase that spacing between the lines if I can. And I have enough space here, so I'm going to move it down a little bit. And it just gives the eyes, a point to rest at the end of each line and then look for the next one instead of just kind of jumping from one to the next, and it just looks stressful. So give it some space, give your design some space. Sometimes it's even easier to reduce the font size a few points so you're able to increase the line spacing. And that will actually help readability, even though you're making the font smaller. So it can really, really be helpful. Now, the opposite is true when we're talking about headlines, because if we're creating a headline, let's say this is our headline, and I'm just gonna put another line there. And we're setting this to the, what do we have here? 1.7? Yes. If we're setting this to 1.7, more or less, like this is too much space. It doesn't work for the headline. So if you only have a few words because you're doing it in a headline or because it's a special design element, you can move the text much closer together. So you can reduce it, look, to almost 1, depending on the font you're using and depending on, the letters. Like here, the G and the T, they work perfectly because they're next to each other. Sometimes when they're right under each other, you can't go as close. But as you can see, you can go a lot closer when you have just very few words. So this is important for headlines where you have very few words, or parts of your design where you just use the text as a design element. You make it really large, and then you can really, the bigger the text is, the closer you can bring the lines together. But only limited amounts of text. You cannot do this with lots of text.